Right. Well, good morning, everybody, and I'd like to also thank the organisers for the kind invitation to speak here on a Sunday morning, and of course, thank you all for showing up to listen to me. I'll do basically a little introduction what you can expect from a readout when you're looking at very high spatial resolution imaging. I'll address the kind of crucial question of the point spread function and how that leads us, amongst from other reasons as well, to try and accelerate acquisition. I'll concentrate mainly in this talk on no, I won't concentrate mainly. I will concentrate exclusively on echoplanar imaging and variants thereof. So I will have a little discussion about the relative merits of 2D simultaneous multi-slice and 3D. And even if you don't immediately associate these with EPI, I will also talk about Grace and spin echo at the end. And just to keep you all primed up, I will mention the possible effects of physiological noise and why you always have to be thinking when you're doing fMRI in which noise regime you're sitting. So let's start off with some requirements for the readout, shall we? We had a laminar workshop in Nijmegen about 2 years ago, and the question was, how long is a piece of string? And the answer is shorter than 1 millimeter, right? So people generally agreed if you want to be in the game for doing laminar, you need to have something better than 1 millimeter, right? And that's a bit of a relative number. I've realized in the sort of passage of time that physicists actually have a tendency to make life difficult for themselves in doing laminar fMRI, in that they tend to do things like very strongly stimulate the primary visual cortex, which happens to be one of the thinnest pieces of isocortex in the brain, whereas if you go off into a nice language or memory region, you might actually have 3 or 4 millimeters of grey matter to play with, and then the resolution that you need, of course, scales to some extent there as well. So let's say we're targeting under 1 millimeter. 7 Tesla and above, you've got to stay within the SAR limits. And actually, even things like spin echo EPI start hitting some problems there. And you've either got to get the right functional contrast out of your readout, or at least not corrupt the functional contrast you want with the readout, okay? So you're going to hear about VASO, which is a blood volume technique at some stage, and I'll mention spin echo later in this talk. And these are all things where your readout can possibly add in a little bit extra information which you didn't necessarily want when you started the experiment. So you can think about these things as long as you like, but at the moment there's no way around using EPI in some kind of variant. And I'm not going to bother with spirals and stacks of spirals and other exotic things, because the other thing you're wanting here is a lot of very high throughput data. So EPI is what you've got. And if you are involved with imaging and if you have a physics background, the first thing you always want to ask yourself is, what does my point spread function look like? And as I think, who already knew this? Come on, without using a computer, you already knew this, right? You didn't already. Who didn't know this? Nobody. You're all cowards. Okay, nobody's going to admit to anything. Right, okay. Basically, if you have a nice, smooth exponential decay in your signal domain, in the time domain, in the frequency domain, you will get something looking like this, which is called a Lorentzian, right? And this is what we tend to like, right, because it's nice and well-defined. And we tend to think of the full-width half maximum of this as being a kind of crucial measure for the quality we've got. So just imagine you could isolate a single voxel and get the signal decay from that voxel and take the Fourier transform from it. And then You can see here that we've got a nice relationship. You can see my mouse? I can see my mouse. Right. Good. Telling us here omega half, and then f a half is 1 over pi T2 star, right? So that's kind of nice that we get this extra pi factor here. And in EPI, you have to worry always about the phase encoding direction, if we're talking about 2D, the fast phase encoding direction, right? So, because that has got a low bandwidth. So ultimately what you're looking at in terms of having a true resolution matching your nominal spatial resolution is you don't want things like the bandwidth per pixel being lower than the lateral line width of said pixel, right? Which mostly sounds like a singe, you know, how the heck could you get in that situation? But actually, if you start trying to think about the arithmetic of doing a 256 by 256 acquisition matrix, which is what you're going to be talking about if you want sub-millimeter resolution and using an EPI readout, you're already in quite a bad place, right? So if we just look at this, the bandwidth in the phase encoding direction is in the kind of non-algebra speak, just the inverse of the time between the echo centers in your readout train. And then you get the bandwidth per pixel by dividing that number by the number of lines you've acquired, right? And you can see, if you think you're doing a nice easy EPI with 1 millisecond between the echo centers, then you're in a reasonable place. You have a kilohertz bandwidth. You divide by 64. Doesn't sound too bad. Go by 256 by 256. Suddenly you have 2 milliseconds between the echo centers, and you want to divide your 500 hertz by 256, and whoops, that doesn't sound so good at all, right? So you want to keep this relationship. Now for some perhaps better news. The other thing, well, there's some good news and there's some bad news. If you think about distortion and dropout, which are the two main things which hit EPI, your distortion is actually going to get worse as your bandwidth goes down in phase encode, right? Whereas when you actually have thin slices, your dropout gets better. So these are two extreme cases here. This is just to shock you, right? Basically, nobody in their right mind would set up an imaging experiment to look like this, but just to remind you what distortion looks like on the left and what dropout looks like on the right here. So, what are we dealing with? Well, if you look at 7 Tesla, which is the core part of this session here, we're looking, as Vitska was saying, at T2 star relaxation time somewhere around here, 25-30 milliseconds. And if you start getting worried about the fact you're imaging blood as well, you've got 7 to 13 milliseconds, right? The T2 of venous blood gets very short, apparently, at 7 Tesla. Not everyone quite agrees with this, but no one succeeded in completely disproving it either. Right, so we live with these numbers in the literature. So, what does this mean for EPI? Well, high in-plane resolution can potentially lead to the true resolution being worse than nominal resolution. And actually, if you think you're imaging venous blood, and it may even be making a pretty large contribution to your signal when you're doing laminar fMRI, you should be seriously worried about this stuff. And I'm just emphasizing this here. If you look at the way you think about distortion and imaging, once you get a small voxel, actually you get a nice line width in that voxel, right? You don't have to worry so much about main field inhomogeneities in that very small voxel you're considering, right? It's a bit of a weird way of thinking about it. If you take a large voxel, 3 by 3 by 3, that's got 27 1 millimeter cubed voxels in it, right? Now, when you look at your 3 by 3 by 3, you get this distortion effect because the signal gets smeared out. Whereas when you're imaging at the higher spatial resolution, you have a better line width within the voxel, but of course the frequency offset leads to those voxels being displaced, right? It's the same conundrum, it just manifests itself differently. So actually it's very important to get your distortion correction good and to get your alignment right. And you'll hear a lot of that later in this session. The other thing is, well, if your target TE, very commonly 20, 25, maybe even 30 milliseconds, that's already constraining your readout duration. So, however you look at these things, you're going to have to accelerate, right? You're going to have to accelerate because you want volume coverage. You're going to have to accelerate because you don't want your line width, your effective bandwidth per pixel getting bad. So we're going to have to speed up. And what can we do? Well, you can put in partial Fourier, which almost everybody does, 7/8, 6/8. You can use grappa or sense, right? Partial parallel imaging. And this has the nice effect of reducing your distortion, right? Because you skip phase encoding lines. Very nice. And if you want to get the sort of volume coverage we need, then you're going to have to use something like simultaneous multi-slice or accelerate in 3D for EPI. Okay? You won't get around this, because if you want to sample the bold response, you really want to be doing this at least with a volume TR of about 3 seconds. So the thing which has been dominating acquisitions for some years has been simultaneous multi-slice, also known as multiband, and the basic idea is to simultaneously get, for example, 3 images, which, if you would just reconstruct them naively, would look like this, with them all collapsed on top of each other. But then, in the usual parallel imaging way, you use the coil sensitivities to disentangle them, and you can substantially accelerate the acquisition in this case. Right? So, for fixed TE kinds of experiments like bold, simultaneous multi-slice will give you a real acceleration, whereas in-plane parallel imaging will just shorten your readout and doesn't lead to a large speed up in the acquisition. One of the important things which people realize, particularly Felix Breuer and the group in Würzburg, was you can actually disentangle these slices from each other better if you start adding a phase gradient onto them. Because according to the Fourier shift theorem, if you want to disentangle, if you have 2 slices which are close to each other and you want to disentangle them, if you could magically shift one of them by half a field of view, you'd be having a much easier time in terms of the coil sensitivities of doing that, right? So just by adding a phase gradient, for example, alternating the phase of lines in K space in one slice but not the other, that will shift it, and your whole problem of disentangling becomes much easier. So the way this was done originally was just by using radio frequency pulses, so that if you excited the 2 slices in the first K space line, the 2 slices would be in phase, and the next K space line, they would be in anti-phase, right? And then you can alternate or put on whatever phase gradient you like. Problem was, of course, that this would not work for EPI, because in EPI you're collecting your lines of data successively after one excitation, right? So you need a way of getting around this problem, of getting the Kuiperine, or as people prefer to say, Kuiper, to work just using gradients. And that came with the blipped Kuiper from Boston. So essentially you get a little set of extra blips along the Z. It's almost like an extra phase encoding in the slice direction, and what this is doing is then for the centers of the slices that you're doing, it's flipping them over backwards and forwards as you want, and at the edges you're only getting a very small effect, which can be largely neglected, and this basically allows you to have the benefits of Kuiperine in a 2D EPI experiment.
And this is just gives you a few examples from out of literature how it looks when you're trying to disentangle these ones on the basis of coil sensitivity. You're obviously having a much harder job than if you're trying to disentangle these. So, if you're doing simultaneous multi-slice, you can see that this is the sort of situation we're talking about where you have no Kuiper factor, and then the bits that you're trying to reconstruct from each other are basically at the same coordinate here, and that's the sort of situation you would have here. If you move to a Kuiper 2 or a Kuiper 3 situation, you will then have this. You will have these far away from each other. So these are at the same position, but they're sufficiently far away that they're being picked up by different coils. Right? So this is the kind of benefit that you need. If you look now, you have to watch out, and here we will often, if we're talking about 7 Tesla, for example, when people were doing the Human Connectome project and getting data at 3 Tesla, they just put everything on Kuiper and didn't do any in-plane acceleration. When you get to 7 Tesla, you still need some in-plane acceleration, and you basically have to watch out you don't get in a tangle between your Kuiper factor and your Grappa or sense factor, which can kind of ruin things for you. For example, if you would happen to pick a Kuiper factor of 2 and a Grappa factor of 2, you would end up essentially losing all the benefits of the Kuiper, because the points you would be reconstructing would be landing basically equivalent to each other again, because the aliasing that you would introduce with the Grappa would effectively cancel out the phase the spatial shift that you would add with the Kuiper. So you then need to add in or make sure that you've got a different Grappa factor which keeps your points well away from each other. And to conclude this session on the 2D, here's an example from Boston, which is 0.75 millimeter isotropic. I think actually this was 10 averages, 256 by 256. And you can see TR of 6 seconds here, right? So you are struggling a little bit to get your volume TR that you need. If you look at the 2D protocol which was used in the Human Connectome project, that went to 1.6 millimeter isotropic, and then you could get to a volume TR of 1 second. But I think you can see that 2D EPI protocols can struggle for whole brain coverage within this kind of 3-second target range. And if you look at quite a lot of people who are using 2D EPI for lamina, they're picking out certain bands or slabs of the brain that they really want to look at. So there's an obvious attraction of 3D imaging here, because, well, 3D doesn't suffer from spin history effects. I always get a bit nervous when I have things like sub-millimeter slice selection about how much stuff can be coming in. You can accelerate using parallel imaging in 2 directions, and you don't have to worry about slice excitation profiles. So you get a somewhat different scenario, right? In 2D, you get 1 slice, and then in 3D, you get the whole volume. So in 3D, you might think you have an advantage because you've got a natural root n, square root of n, efficiency advantage. But in 2D, you let your slice relax, and then you go back to it, right, which gives you a larger magnetization. So when you're doing a limited number of slices, the 2D will often come out better than the 3D in terms of sensitivity. But when you want an awful lot of slices, so that for the 2D, that the volume TR is getting really long compared to the T1 of what you're looking at, then the 3D comes out as being the better advantage. And if we're looking at the sort of flip angles you get in terms of your SAR requirements, of course, if you're imaging with a short TR all the time, you're going to end up with a low Ernst angle compared to when you're doing 2D, and you'll get much higher flip angles as being the Ernst angle here. So, well, I'm glad to see that Marcus is here, as he's one of the originators of the 3D EPI sequence. So, basically, why not do 3D EPI? And essentially, accelerate and read out a plane every time you excite. You can jump lines there, and that will give you some time saving. If we go to essentially leaving out every second phase encode line when we're going through this 3D k-space volume. Now just imagine if we want to cover the same in doing accelerating here, we're going to leave out every second line. Wonderful. And then we go here and leave out every second line in the partition direction as well, and then we can reconstruct. You get a real-time saving, and you get the reduced distortion from having the in-plane acceleration when you acquire. So this has made things quite attractive. You can go think a bit further, because if you're only looking at the two phase encoding directions, which are traditionally labeled KY and KZ, then you can think effectively of the analogous Kaipi type approach to what we were talking about in 2D, that if you only acquire these data, then you will have this kind of aliasing pattern, and then all the acceleration is loaded onto one set of coils, whereas you can spread this out effectively over Y and Z by different types of sampling patterns, and that will give you a better reconstruction, lower G noise. So here are some examples from Benedict Poser, which are going a bit extreme in terms of 16 times acceleration. So you can see 3 millimeter isotropic TR148, 0.8 millimeter isotropic with multi-echo in 8 seconds, and 0.8 millimeter isotropic, which is the sort of thing you'd want for doing laminar fMRI in 2 seconds. I would have to say this is a little bit on the sporty side. We tend to end up with protocols on around 3 seconds for getting close to whole brain coverage, but it's the basic idea is quite important. If we try to summarize what sort of accelerations we think we can get, well, you can get a factor of 3, roughly speaking, in one dimension, just by putting in grappa or sense. You can get up to about a factor of 6 in the SMS direction fairly easily. What you've always got to think of when you're doing simultaneous multi-slice is what is the absolute physical separation of the slices that you're trying to separate from each other compared to the dimensions of the coils that you are using, right? And we're lucky, I think, in terms of doing brain imaging, and am I allowed to say Novamed? The 32-channel coil is more or less the standard which everybody is using, right? So if you're looking at Witzke's slides about how many people are doing RF coils, actually a lot of the time, almost everybody's using the same stuff, right? So we can compare a lot of these protocols with each other. I think ultimately, when you put everything together, you shouldn't probably be aiming for an acceleration factor much above 12 in total when you're doing 3D. So as we move on a bit from gradient echo EPI, we can say a few things about spin echoes, right? Because there's quite a lot in the literature on spin echo and T2 weighted fMRI, particularly at 7 Tesla, right? And of course, if you have in abstracto a spin echo readout, just a pure spin echo, that will refocus your static field in homogeneities, okay? So you will reduce the bold sensitivity for larger blood vessels and their surroundings. Okay, so And this has been a kind of leitmotif in a lot of attempts to improve intrinsic spatial resolution of fMRI at 7 Tesla. It doesn't actually mean that the spin echo is more sensitive to the signal of the capillaries. Actually, the gradient echo is still more sensitive to the capillary signal. It just means that the spin echo signal should not be contaminated by the large vessel contributions. So if you were a purist, then you would try to do some kind of T2 weighted experiment with a string of spin echoes, otherwise known as turbo spin echo or haste or something like that. But you would soon find out you can't do this at 7 Tesla because you would be putting in far too much RF energy. Okay, so because of the high SAR, we are still required to use EPI or something akin to EPI, even if we want to look at a spin echo. So if we're looking at the readout with EPI, we can say a few other things. Well, basically, if you go to spin echo, it's always going to be a little bit less efficient because your TE then has to match the T2 and not the T2 star. Right? So you end up with something more like a 50 millisecond TE requirement at 7 Tesla rather than the 25 millisecond TE or 20 that you'd be targeting with a gradient echo. If you put in a long EPI readout, and we can have a discussion in the corridor afterwards as to what long actually means, you will get some measure of T2 prime contamination in this, right? So this is the sort of corruption of your contrast that I was talking about at the start. And it then makes it very difficult to get whole brain coverage or anything akin to it with sufficient spatial and temporal resolution. So about 5 or 6 years ago, we were super happy when we managed with very many technical tricks to get 1.5 millimeter isotropic whole brain in 2 seconds, right? And beyond that, I don't think anyone's got, but really 1.5 millimeter, it's not quite cutting it for laminar and columns, right? So, and if you would then want to do what I was just arguing for gradient echo, well, we go to some super intelligent 3D acquisition to get around it, you run back into the SAR problems, right? So where people have gone with this mainly is to use something known as gradient and spin echo, and to look at limited volumes of the brain. And people after me, I could have talked about this for a long time, but I won't. People after me will talk a lot about whether you want to look at large areas of brain and look at it, whether how regions are interacting, or whether you want to look at small regions of the brain and try and get a real true representation of the laminar activation profile of that region. If you go for these limited brain regions, of course, you can't really look at interactions very easily, but you do stand the chance of absolutely optimizing everything in that volume in terms of the shim and the B1 homogeneity, etc., etc. So, just to go back to the originals and the basics, there was the original Grace sequence looked something like this: 90, 180, 180, right? And essentially, it's of course a string of spin echoes with a gradient echo readout associated with it. And in my more wicked moments, I tend to say things like it has all the disadvantages of turbo spin echo and EPI, and a few of its own as well. But it's essentially a nice way of accelerating things. When I say a few of its own as well, I mean particularly this kind of thing. This is getting back to my obsession with point spread functions. This is the sort of thing that can happen to you in 2D Grace, And 2D grace is a horrible challenge for an imaging physicist because it's one of the few sequences where you cannot predict the order of the signal decay to make it a monotonic decaying function, because you've got a mixture of T2 and T2 star decays in your experiment. So there is a smart way around it. 3D grace, right? Open an extra dimension, and here you have the possibility that you can project all the T2 decay down one axis and the T2 star decay down the other axis, and you're back in a clean space regarding your point spread function. Originally, when this was first proposed in '94 by Song et al., it was known as echo volumer imaging, which was a kind of analogy to Peter Mansfield EV, which was a true single-shot 3D gradient echo sequence. In its more modern manifestations, David Feinberg, who proposed the original 2D grace sequence, also proposed this sort of inner volume approach for doing high-resolution fMRI. It goes back to an ISMRM proceeding of just over 10 years ago now, which essentially allows you to have make a volume selection by using your readout gradient for one, and then two orthogonal slice gradients for the other two. And if you look at this in practice, this was a study came from Maastricht a few years ago. You can see the kind of volumes where people are using. So the grace is on the left, and the spin echo EPI activation analogous on the right. And if we look at the protocols they were using, essentially this is being limited to a 30 by 120 by 10 field of view. And then you have a 30 millisecond EPI readout and a 216 millisecond total echo train duration. I'll finish with some thoughts on noise, right? So basically, without worrying about the details, but years ago, Kruger and Glover kind of showed that most fMRI is in the physiological noise regime. This is a spontaneous question. Who already knew this? Right, okay. For those that didn't, which seems to be the bulk of people here, that basically means that the physics noise is not important. It means that your time course noise is dominated by physiological variation, right? Either it's the intrinsic variation in the bold, or it's respiration, or it's something cardiac. But basically, that physiological noise is proportional to the signal. So it means that, for example, increasing your field strength doesn't give you a lot of benefit because you increase your signal and you increase your noise in the same ratio. It also means when you do things like parallel imaging, which reduce your acquisition window, you don't care about it, right? Normally, when you reduce the amount of data you collect, you reduce your sensitivity, right? Because you're just collecting data for less time. So mostly in fMRI, we get away with hell, right? Because we can accelerate as much as we like in all sorts of wacky ways, and it doesn't affect our fMRI sensitivity. We're in the physiological noise regime. But I've got bad news for you. You want to do laminar, you want to do true laminar or columns, you're in the thermal noise regime, right? So this is the most modern data. This is from the Boston group. These are all larger voxels, like 1 by 1 by 3 millimeter, with 32 channels, sort of equipment everyone's using. But this straight line means you're on the thermal noise regime, and this is the 1 by 1 millimeter, 1 by 1 by 1 millimeter voxel, right? So you are clearly at the voxel level in the thermal noise regime. So It's true, so if you only smooth to a small degree. If you do a lot of smoothing or averaging of signal over layers, actually, you get back in the physiological noise regime, right? It's an important point. You get very rapidly in the physiological noise regime because the physiological noise in pure grey matter is much higher than in white matter. So all those 3 mm Vopsol experiments, they were looking at a mixture of grey and white matter. When you look at pure grey matter, the physiological noise is higher. You're much faster in physiological noise. So, but if you're in the thermal noise regime, watch out. Maximize the efficiency of your sequence by minimizing the dead time and having excitation angles close to the Ernst angle, right? With that, Wietske will now release the quiz questions. Yeah, they're all free. Everyone, if anyone who mostly people were walking out during my talk rather than walking in. It was most depressing, I can tell you. But if you go to gmp3.cnf.io, for anyone who happen to walk in, you can page your way to the quiz. We'll be interested to see what the results are as they come up. I'm a very honest person, but I'm also a person of finite memory. I have acquired many slides over the years from very many people. These are the ones I definitely think I should be acknowledging. Anybody else in the audience who thinks I should be acknowledging them, my apologies. I would then like to thank you all for your attention, and we'll open up maybe for a question if there's time.